40, Acts 5:40 through 42. The council accepted his advice, called in the apostles, had them beaten, and then told them never again to speak in the name of Jesus, and finally let them go. So they take the advice, but they're like, well, if these men are of God, because he's telling them if they're of God, then just leave them alone. But they decide, okay, yeah, we'll listen to your advice after we beat them. So it shows that even no matter what, if there's good sense thrown in, we as Christians ain't going to be treated like everybody else. Regardless of who may have good sense, the world's going to mistreat us in ways because we represent Christ. Now, the name of Christ is the only name out in the world that people don't like having heard, because it's the only name that people can be saved by. His name has power. And of course, this world being against Christ is not going to like hearing the name of Christ. The world's going to be against it. They were against it since Jesus started his ministry. They'll be against it till he comes back and they start crying out to him. So they let them go. This is part of God's plan for them to go, because they had a purpose to do. God was going to have them be freed anyway. We see later how some get put in prison, but God sets them free, because it's God's will for them to be gone to do His will. It's just this time it so happens that they freely let them go, and God don't directly have to intervene. But they were going to be gone anyway. They just chose to do it the easy way. They left the council chamber, rejoicing that God had counted them worthy to suffer dishonor for His name. We see this later with Stephen, how he's being stoned, but he's praising the name of the Lord. There's historical accounts where this happens, where somebody's persecuted and they sing out praise to the Lord. You know, they saw the honor to be beaten because it meant because they saw themselves as they should, no better than their Lord. And if the Lord got beaten, then who are they not to? So they considered it an honor to be put in the same place He was, to be before this court like He was. They also knew that because they were released, they still had to go out and proclaim His name. Later, they would all be persecuted unto death. But they were freed here. They knew a life of Christ for Christ wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to come simple. It wasn't going to be the best. It was good, but ideally there was a lot of challenges that it brought on. But them challenges were worth it, because they got to make the Lord happy, and they got to serve Him. In spite of all the persecution out in the world today, it's usually in the places where the persecution is the strongest, where the Christians take the strongest stand in their faith. And it goes for the opposite. The places where persecution is the least, you have the weakest Christians. Because they don't have to fight for their faith. They don't have to stand up for it. It's just what they have. They go to church. Nobody stops them, so one day they decide not to go. And then the next week they'd go. But in areas where persecution is, people go to church multiple times. Anytime they get a chance. Even though they can be killed for doing it. It's just a strange way how it works. Now, the numbers are probably fewer in persecuted church, but those persecuted area, but those that are there are a lot stronger in their faith, because they're willing to risk it all. And as Christians, we should be willing to risk everything for the Lord, because He gave up everything for us. But too many times we ain't willing to take any steps outside of our own comfort zone. Verse 42. And every day in the temple and in their homes, Bible classes, they continued to teach and preach that Jesus is Messiah. So they did this daily. They didn't wait till meet every week. We complain about sometimes how we have too much church. They met daily. They were at one point a community. So the church was always together at one point in time. And oftentimes people complain that a couple hours a week gets in the way of their time and they don't want to be here. The original church, there was no going to church. They were the church. Anytime they gathered together, it was in the name of the Lord. And they met in a temple. This was one place that the Jewish people did not want them to proclaim the name of Jesus. Yet in spite of it, they met there anyway. They didn't go to the tabernacle. They went directly to the temple. This is where all the priests worked and lived. This is the area that would have got most notice among the Jews, because they would have been going there for sacrifices. It would have been the most ideal place for them to preach to the Jews, because all the Jews at one point would have went there. Not necessarily every Jew may have went to the tabernacle, but they went to the temple to offer sacrifices. And they taught the Bible in their homes. They didn't just leave it to, well, let's go to the temple, hear this lesson, and then go on our way. They kept teaching the Bible. They made it a part of their everyday life. They didn't just rely on hearing somebody else a few times a week. They dwelled in the Word. They studied the Word. They lived by the Word. The only way we can truly live by the Word is by reading it constantly, by staying in it, by studying it ourselves. And that's what they were doing. That's why the early church grew so fast. They were doing everything they needed to. They were meeting regular, and they were studying the Word. They weren't just gathering together. They were seriously preparing to do what the Lord had called them to do. They saw enjoyment and got enjoyment from what the Lord called them to do. They bonded, we see that later, and had meals. And they rested. But then they did what the Lord called them to do. They didn't complain about what the Lord called them to do. They took the opportunity and went out and did it, because that's what the Lord led them to do. Too many times we as a church see opportunities and just hope somebody else takes them, instead of praying about it and seeing if it's for us ourselves. And they preached that Jesus is the Christ. See, this is something that the Jews would have understood more than anybody. The Jews were looking for the Christ, the Messiah, the Anointed One, to come. And many of them may have heard stories about Jesus, but they were telling them exactly who He was and what He exactly did. We as Christians got the Word to each people, but we all got our own testimony to share with them too. At one point in time, before the Gospels were pinned down, all they were sharing about Jesus was their own personal testimony about Him. So if we don't remember Scriptures, we always got our testimony to go back to when telling others about Christ.